So both Manny and I are here today to talk about the pillars of privacy and steps that you can take to protect data within your organisation. Now, just before we make a start, my legal guys have asked me just to share a quick statement, that being that the views shared are both Manny and my own personal opinions as security and GRC practitioners, not necessarily the opinions of the companies that we work for. At all times, you should always consider consulting your legal and compliance teams for the most appropriate advice in relation to your privacy matters internally. So with that little formality behind us, perhaps we can make a bit of a start on today's session. Before we get into the detail, I wanted to, obviously start with something maybe just to level set. A common question that comes up is, what is privacy? What is personal information? I thought I'd go back to the basics and start with the Privacy Act of Australia, which says that personal information is information or opinion about an identified individual or an individual who is reasonably identifiable. Outside of that definition, there are many different types under the Act, which include sensitive information such as perhaps racial or ethnicity or political views, health information. We're walking around with Fitbits and other trackers these days, and that information could be construed as health information. Credit information, I'm sure all of us are carrying around credit cards in our bank accounts, and also employee information. We all generally work for companies, or maybe in some cases we work for ourselves, and there's information relating to our employment which could be sensitive. Privacy itself, in my opinion, should be viewed or can be viewed as the ability to control and to expect the protection of that personal information. And privacy is really why we're all here today to have a bit of a conversation. So Manny, if I could ask you, in your view, what are some of the elements of a privacy framework?
Thank you, Sam. I would like to provide a generic rather than a specific view of what does a privacy regime mean. So privacy means that the processing, which includes the collection, receipt, recording, organization, collation, storage, or updating or modification of personal information, which means information related to an identifiable, living, natural person, and recorded in any format, regardless of the form, including books, maps, plans, or drawings, by a responsible party. So it could be a public or private body alone or in conjunction with others. So it's all about the chain of processing of personal information recorded in any format by a responsible party.
Very good. Thanks for that, Manny. If I can ask you another question, but why do you see privacy as such an important topic at the moment?
So this all came from the business. We all understand that compliance is a not scary story for the business. We as a security professionals always try to buy the attention and commitment from the leadership. We all understand that our information security management system project won't become successful if we don't have the board support. But we need to understand the perspective from the board. So from the CEO perspective, it's all about brand and reputation. So if you have a breach, what's going to happen to you? From the Chief Operations Officer, it's all about effectiveness and efficiency of your operational environment. From the Chief Privacy Officer, it's about entrusted, sensitive, and personal information handled to your organization. From the CIO perspective, how IT can play as a business enabler role. And from compliance perspective, which is our doormate, to start having that conversation with the leadership, it's all about legal and regulatory and contractual requirements. These views with the business can help us to drive business better, to drive privacy better across the business.
Sure. I guess to add in some of my own perspective here, I mean, I totally agree with what you're talking about. When we're talking about privacy, we shouldn't just be talking about it as a security risk or an IT control. Right? The need to ensure that privacy in place is a whole of enterprise or whole of organisation initiative. Getting privacy wrong obviously presents a risk to the business, but if we turn risk on its head and look at it in terms of an opportunity, in terms of an organisation that can get privacy right, it can actually turn into a competitive advantage, to your point there of it being both a business enabler and something that enforces good brand and good reputation. And that competitive advantage spills into things like how you deal with your consumers, how you deal with your customers and your business partners and other parties. And having a good reputation when it comes to upholding privacy can really help grow your business and make your partnerships easier. For those that are interested, actually Forrester just released a very interesting article about how organizations around the world view privacy as an emerging competitive differentiator. And just to pull a quick stat from that, 26% of organizations in Australia highlighted that they do see at present privacy as being a business differentiator for them. Okay. So Manny, another question for you. I mean, why the focus on privacy in Australia at the moment?
Thank you, Sam. I would love to say that as security professionals, our focus is always around Australian Privacy Principle number 11, which is all about information security perspective of privacy. And that's the current splash within the landscape. So APP 11, there are 4 key clauses within APP 11. So clause 1 is about APP entity required to take active measures to ensure the security of personal information it holds. So when it comes to personal information holders, that's the tricky part. So from the privacy commissioner point of view, everybody with access to the personal information considered as a holder of our data. So when it comes to our obligation between us and our suppliers, we need to understand that based on this statement, both of us have equal responsibility to protect that personal information. The second clause is about the an APP entity must take reasonable steps to protect the information from misuse, interference, and loss, as well as unauthorized access, modification, or disclosure. The Privacy Commissioner, along with this line, so what does reasonable steps mean? They published the guidelines to protect personal information. What does reasonable steps mean? But in the overall view, they need organizations to have a mature information security management system, including personal information assets. And it's important for APP entities to continuously monitor and improve their current ISMS posture. Those reasonable steps also need to include preparation and implementation of a data breach policy and response plan. So the mandatory data breach notification act that's coming February next year is going to make a significant change within the privacy landscape, and it's going to enforce the organization to take privacy really much more seriously. And also, an APP entity must take reasonable steps to destroy or de-identify the personal information that it holds. So which means that the Privacy Commissioner needs you to identify the personal information through the life cycle of your organization and reasonably protect those personal information along with their life cycle. But Sam, I would like to also ask you, what do you see as other drivers around the Asia Pacific?
Absolutely, Manny. So obviously Australia is moving through very rapidly with the adoption of the Australian Privacy Principles, the preparation for the mandatory data breach disclosure laws which come into effect early next year. But it's not the only regulation that I think organisations in Australia are exposed to. We look at organisations that perhaps are operating in other geographies, and I'm sure they're becoming more and more aware of some of the other drivers around the region. Just to quickly summarise some of those, we can look to Singapore in terms of the Personal Data Protection Act, or PDPA, Philippines in terms of the Data Protection Act, or DPA, Hong Kong in terms of the privacy ordinances that have come through, sometimes referred to as PCPD, as well as Japan in terms of the Act on the Protection of Personal Information. This means that organisations that are operating perhaps in a multi-geography or dealing with customers that are based in those particular territories should be considering some of the local privacy regulations that may impact their business and by virtue of that, their operations. We then have, of course, one of the more pervasive regulations which is coming through from the EU, that being the General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR as it's known. This is something that's quite far-reaching in terms of it's not just its geographic reach, with it being applicable to most nations within Europe, but also for those organisations doing business within Europe. For all of these, there's been a lot of, I guess, news coming out. That being because some of them are newly released, that being because some of them have been updated recently. So I think it's quite a poignant time for organisations to be looking at their privacy programs. Hopefully it's not just the regulation that's driving the focus that organisations have on their privacy programs at the moment, but a consideration for, I guess, what can go wrong out there. There have been a lot of cases where we're seeing organisations unfortunately suffer data breaches, and we're seeing the impact that that has on the customers and business partners and employees of those organisations. So obviously it's a good corporate citizenship thing, not just a compliance thing, to be looking at some of these areas. Now, if I was to distill down some of the requirements into some common elements, and again, these are my opinions here rather than those of RSA's, what I've got up on screen at the moment is a general summary of some of the things that organisations might wish to consider when it comes to their privacy program. I won't go through all of these, but I think some of the most important, some of the most common ones that we're seeing is around how we tell individuals how their personal data is going to be used, how we might make sure that we keep personal data secure, how we make sure that staff are appropriately trained in the care and handling of personal data. And another point there, how we build privacy into product, software and services design. We make sure that as we onboard new business processes, new projects, new systems, that privacy is a key and early consideration of those activities. And then, of course, finally, another point which is quite a common topic of conversation in Australia at the moment, that being around the ability to notify impacted individuals, or in some cases the regulators, in the event of a serious data breach. So certainly a lot to consider there. I'm not trying to overwhelm everybody, but my key point here is that in order to, I guess, address the needs of privacy at the moment, you need a robust operational framework to make sure that it's living and breathing within your organisation, and not just a point-in-time activity. Question then becomes, how do you do that? Well, you need to start with the pillars. Now, whenever anyone mentions the word pillar to me, I usually think of something foundational, perhaps a blueprint or an architect's diagram, and the sorts of things that come to mind. So just like building a house, we need to think about the pillars that need to be put in place to support our privacy program. So Manny, a quick question for you. For organisations that are looking to enhance their privacy programs, what do you see as some of those capabilities?
Of course. The best starting point should be always the leadership. So personal information, that's a business matter that belongs to the business, and the leadership needs to take an important lead on that. Saying that, so the initiatives of this lead should come from the compliance department. So, and with their support and create a strong business case, we can get attention from the senior leadership from that side. I would like to have a bit deep dive around the personal information security, so the life cycle of personal information within the organization. So the Privacy Commissioner requires the businesses to identify the places that they collect or receive the personal information, and create a strong business case as to why do they need those personal information. And if they require that personal information, where is that personal information? What is the scope of that personal information? What people, processes, and technologies have been involved? And they need to consider privacy as of the design of that scope. So we all understand the project won't become successful if you haven't planned that project properly. And that's the concept of the privacy by design. So when you understand the scope, when you understand the people, processes, and technologies, you need to perform a privacy impact assessment against the personal information. So privacy impact assessment, the easiest way from a security professional's point of view to describe it is that most of the companies, most of the organizations, they already have a risk management framework. So the easiest and the simplest approach to this is to consider personal information as an asset for the risk management framework. So when you consider personal information as an asset, you will identify, analyze, and assess the risks to this personal information. And based on those risks, you will choose the controls to reasonably protect those personal information. And so I will talk about these reasonable set and controls a little bit later. And also, along the end of the journey of the personal information, you need to have processes to, again, identify, to destroy or de-identify the personal information that's been entrusted to you. So you should understand the reason and the business case for the personal information, how long do you need it, and what's the process to de-identify those personal information. But we talked about the security controls. So the Privacy Commissioner recommended to the reasonable steps to protect personal information, or the due diligence in matter, is about ISO 27001 standard. So majority of the controls that we are going to talk about in this slide came from ISO 27001. So the brain of the controls is about governance, culture, and training. So as we discussed before, the first step should be leadership. From the leadership perspective, and as a top-down approach, we need to understand the objective and the value of the personal information to the business, and who's going to own it, who's going to oversight it, who's going to become responsible to continuously protect and monitor those personal information. And the leadership also, they need to start initiating to embed training for across the organization. Every person with access to the personal information, they need to understand their own obligation towards those personal information. There must be standard and documented security controls in place to reflect how do you want to protect the personal information. For instance, you need to have access control regime in place, documented framework, as well as how do you want to register privilege management and access to the personal information. You must have ICT security controls. So once you have your standard and documented policies and frameworks in place, you need to tune your ICT and infrastructure environment to adopt those documented standards. You should also, as we discussed before, you need to have a strong access control regime to control and provision users to those personal information along the life cycle. Physical security is very important as a classical and still very important piece of control to protect the personal information. Third-party suppliers. So majority of our businesses these days, especially on the commercial businesses, they are outsourced. And as we discussed before, in terms of the definition of the whole there, so suppliers have equal responsibilities to protect the personal information. However, there is also that outsource with obligation to our suppliers. We need to have a regime in place. We need to identify the suppliers that have access to our personal information, having a strong contractual obligations against those suppliers, and continuously monitor those contractual obligations, make sure that they take information security reasonably seriously. And also, as Sam mentioned, that we need to have a database response plan, a strong regime to detect and respond to the breach of personal information. We should understand that the modern age is not about our preventive controls are not more effective. So it's all about how quick we can detect that we have a breach. Even now that we talk about, majority of us already have a breach, so we need to change our mindset. So based on the fact that I already have a breach, how quick I can detect the breach and be very efficient in my response. Sam, do you agree on the whole thing? What's your view of the whole chain of the controls here?
I do agree, Nate. I guess to bring it down to back to that message around the key pillars. A lot of the activities that you've talked about there are absolutely required to get the life cycle up and running. So distill it back down into the key pillars though, and this comes into some of RSA's key messaging around running privacy programs. We really see it as 4 key stages. Right, one, as you mentioned before, around governance. Understanding what sort of information the business uses, understanding how relatively important one information asset is over another, and then making sure there's a good understanding around things like how long information needs to be retained for, who uses that information within the organisation, and maybe even things like what third parties have access. Next, it becomes a conversation around risk. So it becomes about understanding, well, we have these assets, what level of risk do they carry for us? Then going through and understanding from a compliance perspective, as you've mentioned in your previous slide, what sort of controls do we need to put in place so that we reasonably protect those assets? There's certainly no prescriptive requirement of what needs to be there, but once we go through and understand what we reasonably need to do, that becomes the control framework that gets put in place, as you've just articulated quite well on your previous slide. The final element that we see, so following that governance, risk and compliance model, is how we not only prepare for and monitor, but how we respond. That becomes very much around the data breach process. So making sure that we've got a good understanding of what's happening within our organisation, perhaps not just relying on the people and process side of things, but actually bringing technology into the mix so that we can look at, maybe our security infrastructure tools or our SIEMs or our packet monitoring solutions, so that we can understand at a technical level anything untoward that might be happening within the organisation, so that we can then get visibility of those cases, make sure that we're taking a measured and accurate response, and that we're not just engaging people within the security organisation, but that we're engaging HR, that we're engaging corporate communications, that we're engaging legal, and taking the approved steps to make sure we handle those breach scenarios as best as possible. So next, I guess, the question of how we put some of these things in place. So Manny, a quick question for you, but what role is your organisation, content security, playing when it comes to helping organisations with their privacy programs?
So as part of our generic advisory services that we provide around information security and governance, risk and compliance, in terms of the privacy, we always advise our clients to start with the privacy readiness assessment. If I want to make it more generic, this is pretty much a security posture assessment that most of the organizations that are performing these days, but be more specific and focused around the personal information. So the purpose of this activity is to review and identify the personal information within the business and through the life cycle, and understand the current security posture in place to protect those personal information. So yeah, we can just quickly go through let's just quickly run through what does it mean and the value of the privacy readiness assessment. Yeah. So the journey of the privacy readiness assessment starts from the context establishment. As we discussed before, first step is always have a chat with the leadership. It's important from the leadership perspective to understand the value and the reason of having personal information within your business, and also understand who owns, which processes are involved in handling those personal information. We should then sit down with the process owners as being identified with the leadership to understand the life cycle of the personal information within the business. I should say before moving any further, something very important that you need to add to this slide is that when it comes to the privacy, we should understand that this is about people, processes, and technologies. So it's not something that are tools just by themselves can be answered, and also it's not something that only a process can be driven. It's a combination of those. So this engagement, privacy readiness assessment, mostly from the process perspective, how should the journey look like? So as we discussed, it's starting with the context establishment and then going through identifying the personal identifying information within the business, and then starting reviewing the controls, the policy and framework in place, policies, security standards, and artifacts in place around the security controls, and then performing information security review against the generic ISMS controls, such as access controls, operation security, communication security, HR security. All of these controls are very similar to what ISO 27001 or any other ISMS standards recommend these days. So we gather this personal information, we understand the personal information, we understand the security controls in place, but then you need to identify the effectiveness and efficiency of those security controls. What we recommend our clients to use is the privacy maturity assessment. So the privacy maturity assessment, it's very similar to capability maturity model recommended by ISACA. So the controls maturity could be non-existent. From the risk perspective, it's going to be very high, or initial, which means that there is a very ad hoc and non-consistent controls in place. Could be repeatable, means that the controls have been adopted widely, but there is no documented information to back up and support it. Could be defined, means that those practices have been defined and established through security standards. Can be managed, means that all of those security standards and practices have been established by leadership. There is a link to the leadership and business, and there's a top-down approach on information security. And that can be optimized, means that you continuously monitor and improve that security control. So based on that, we can identify that, okay, against all of these security controls recommended by ISMS or Privacy Commissioner, that can be your current maturity of the controls. And that's the current posture. And also, we can provide you what is the industry requirement, what is the least security posture from your own recommended for your own industry, and also what does compliance or privacy commissioner ask you to be. So going back to the privacy readiness assessment journey, so we analyze and assess the information, and then from there we should generate a report with a very well-tuned executive summary without technical jargon to tell them what is the risk of those personal information and deficiencies within your security controls. But as Sam mentioned before, we should be very opportunistic. We are not there to scare the board. We are there to enable them and create opportunities, to provide this vision of how security can complement their goals and objectives. And based on that, based on this privacy readiness assessment, we should implement, or we can draft an improvement roadmap as of over the next year or so, what kind of changes and journey is going to be looked like. But Sam, I talked about the processes and people that's required for this regime. And may I ask you from the RSA Archer perspective and from the tools and technology perspective, what are the best ways that you recommend for the clients to start with?
Thanks very much, Manny. I'm actually very happy to announce that I was fortunate enough to go to the RSA Charge event over in Dallas last week, which is basically a user summit that we run for our RSA customers. And at the event, we actually launched several new products within the RSA Archer suite to help our customers with the specific privacy challenges that they're facing at the moment, many of which we've talked about during the discussion today. But very pleased to announce that there are 3 new use cases that we've launched with RSA Archer. The first being RSA Archer Data Governance, which is all about getting that understanding of what personal data processing activities occur within the organization, making sure that there's a clear view of things like retention schedules, the ability to run checklists, and making sure that notice and consent activities are captured accurately. That really provides that first pillar that we talked about earlier in the presentation. That next builds up from there to the second use case that we've just launched to help our customers with privacy, that being the RSA Archer Privacy Program Management, which is all about maintaining assessment scopes for personal and sensitive data environments, conducting things like privacy impact assessments, and making sure that the right controls are documented and captured as part of an ongoing living and breathing privacy management framework. The final element is actually an element or an offering that RSA has had for about 3 or 4 years now, but it certainly becomes very much more relevant to a lot of organizations now with the significant uptick in privacy regulation, that being RSA Archer Breach Management. And that's that final pillar that I was talking about before, about not only being prepared for, but being able to execute when a data breach does occur. So everything from making sure that you can bring context out of your security tools to understand the sorts of incidents that may represent data breaches within your organization, the ability to conduct breach impact assessments, so being able to understand things like the extent of a breach, maybe the types of data that's impacted. From that preparedness aspect, the ability to maintain runbooks, so to understand who within the organisation needs to be contacted when a breach occurs. You know, who are the legal contacts, the HR contacts, the corporate communications contacts, which often extend beyond the IT organisation, and what are the steps that we need to take to make sure that the business takes a measured response in the event of a data breach. So many of those are just some quick examples of how RSA Archer is helping its customers from a technology perspective. So I hope that's been helpful in answering that question. Fantastic. Okay. So with that in mind, I guess recapping on some of the things that we've talked about, I hope that the session today has been helpful in understanding, I guess, some of the emerging drivers when it comes to privacy. You know, not just talking about the things that end up in the front page, but talking about the things that are changing from a regulatory and compliance aspect, but also from an opportunity aspect. Okay, you can look at privacy not just as a legal requirement or a compliance initiative, but as a potential differentiator for your business. We also hope that it's been helpful in understanding, I guess, some of the pillars that can support an effective privacy program, as well as some of the capabilities that organisations like Content Security and RSA can bring to the table in helping you accelerate your journey towards having an effective, robust and operational privacy program.